Hello, everybody. Welcome to Pediatric Grand Rounds. I want to remind all of you that this month we are focusing our Grand Rounds on issues related to health equity. And that's the case today as well. And I'm going to turn it over to our residency program director, Dr. Meg McNamara, to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Rafi. And good morning or good afternoon, everyone. I am absolutely delighted today to welcome back Adam Schickedance. I think many of you know Adam because he was a PLUS resident here and a medical student before that. So for those of you who don't, Adam Schickedance is now a general pediatrician and health services researcher at UCLA's main campus, who works clinically with the LA County Department of Public Health Services at Olive View UCLA Medical Center. And his work focuses on developing new models of pediatric primary care to address childhood adversity and families' social and economic determinants of health. Dr. Schickedance received his undergraduate and graduate medical training at UCSF, and then following his chief residency, pursued a fellowship in health services research as a Robert Wood Johnson Clinical Scholar at UCLA. He received his doctorate in health policy and management at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health, focusing on the relationships between adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and life course and intergenerational health. He's currently on faculty in the UCLA Department of Pediatrics and also serves as the director of the Harbor UCLA Medical Financial Partnership, chair of the ACEs Committee of the Southern California American Academy of Pediatrics chapter, the APA's Region 9 co-chair, and the UCLA site lead for the University of California Network for Child Poverty, Health, and Public Policy, and is a member of the Research Advisory Committee for UCSF's Social Interventions Research and Evaluation Network. Very busy man. But and in addition, Dr. Schickedance and Dr. Heather Schickedance are parents to Aria, who was born at the Parnassus campus, and foster parents to baby Abel, who is now 6 weeks old. And Adam, it's a pleasure to have you back again. I still miss you. I was Adam's continuity clinic preceptor for several years, during which time he developed our own medical financial partnership, and welcome back. Can't wait to hear what you have to say.
Thank you, Dr. McNamara. It's such a pleasure to be back with you guys, and I've missed you too. I really am looking forward to this conversation. And my first challenge is going to be figuring out how to make sure that I'm projecting the right part of my presentation so you don't see the presenter view, but actually see the slides themselves. Hopefully, did that work?
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. So you're seeing the poverty, purpose, and practice, I hope.
Yep.
Fantastic, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm sorry I can't see your videos. I wish I could. I'm really happy to be back though and see your names in the attendee lists and see some good friends among the panelists here. And I'm happy to be talking with you about our topic, which is scarcity, its effect on health, the practice of medicine, and what we can do about it. First, I'd like to say thanks. This is a really rare treat for so many friends to see you guys again, and see so many colleagues that I had at UCSF, and I feel I still have. And I also want to say thanks because so many of the ideas that I'll cover in this talk found their initial spark from work there with you almost a decade ago. I really appreciate this time that we have together again today, and I'll try and make the most of it. So as we dive in, I should say, there are no relevant conflicts or disclosures to mention, but I do want to offer a warning. So warning, this might not be a typical grand rounds, and the goal isn't to advance knowledge of a specific disease process or the latest advance in a niche area of clinical medicine. The talk today will be on a topic that we all have lived experience with. So I hope it will be more personally relevant to all of us, though talking about topics that hit close to home might be uncomfortable at times. So, risks of this talk, so to speak, might include introspection, appreciation, and open conversation with colleagues there with you in person if you're in a space where you have neighbors close by in the room, or conversation in the chat, which we'll get to later on in the conversation. You could call those, in addition to the learning objectives that were posted, introspection, appreciation, conversation, you could call those the learning objectives for the next hour. And here's some context. We're on a rock floating through space, 93 million miles from the nearest star that sustains us, on a minor spiral arm of a galaxy that formed 4.5 billion years ago, and is over 6 billion times more vast end to end than the distance from us to our sun. In a universe that's 14 billion years old, containing at least 100 billion galaxies that we can observe, each with hundreds of billions of stars circled by trillions of planets, out of which ours happens to be the only one on which we, or any life that we know of, exist. Our existence, indeed the existence of every living thing on Earth, is highly improbable. If Earth formed 10% closer to or further from the sun than its current orbit, we would have evaporated or frozen long ago, right? And we've only just arrived, with the entirety of our history amounting to just a blip on the cosmic timescale, and no guarantee that we'll be here very long. So we're the ultimate underdogs, with the deck stacked against us and against our survival in a universe of cards against humanity. And yet here we are, somehow, despite the odds, to make the most of this scarce and precious opportunity we call life. So scarcity is a fundamental condition of our existence. Is it any wonder then that we're so attuned to it for adaptation and survival? Down here on Earth, we're acutely aware of various forms of scarcity: food, poverty, time, health, right? What links all of these is the experience of having more needs than resources. And I'll argue that our response to scarcity in any of these forms has some common features, some of which help us adapt to the scarcity in the short term, but can present challenges and create serious problems as well. So to address these common challenges to our very human psychological response to scarcity in various forms, which has been ingrained in us through millions of years of evolution, I'll suggest some remedies, beginning with the awareness of that scarcity and how we respond to it, and recognition of those responses. We can respond to scarcity in different ways, right? We can respond with nihilism, pugilism, humanism, but the core psychological experiences common throughout various forms of scarcity seem to include these: focus dividends, tunneling, bandwidth tax, and scarcity traps. And we'll go through each of these concepts one by one. This framing, I should say, is based on the work of two absolutely brilliant scientists, Sendhil Mullainathan and Eldar Shafir, an economist and cognitive neuroscientist at Harvard and Princeton, respectively. And evidence from cognitive science would frame these as a cascade. The book that Dr. Mullainathan and Dr. Shafir posited that a cascade of these effects can be self-perpetuating in a cycle that can establish what might be called a scarcity mindset, as is depicted here. So let's talk about each of these effects. First is focus dividends, right? The reason that deadlines are useful, whether you're paying your taxes, and we still have a month, or pre-rounding, is that time scarcity captures our attention to focus on the task at hand. For instance, when preparing for a presentation, hypothetically, the first few months ahead of time tend to be not very productive. Other deadlines and projects take precedence because they're due. But as the presentation deadline nears, time scarcity brings your attention more and more to the fact that you really ought to spend some time thinking about your slides. And that focus pays dividends in the form of greater productivity and efficiency, because your mind is forced to prioritize the presentation in the scarce time that you have left to complete it. We use this trick over and over again as busy health professionals living under constant time scarcity. The same can be said of financial or resource scarcity. The less money we have, the more frugally we use it, right? The scarcity, money scarcity, as we'll see, quite literally captures our mind's attention so that we can attend to our impending poverty. But this increased attention to the scarce resources distracts us from other things. And that brings us to the next effect, which is tunneling. This is the downside of our focus dividends. When we perceive that we may lose something we value, like time or housing or health, it's hard to think about much else, right? Our minds are so good at focusing on not losing that scarce resource that we can enter an attentional tunnel vision, right? If we're worried about our health, we focus on it, crowding out other things. So what's going on here? Well, we can think of our working memory as having a certain capacity or bandwidth. When our working memory isn't preoccupied with deadlines or financial pressures or other consequences of scarcity, it's free to use all of our brain's processing power, full bars. But the scarcity mindset hijacks part of our working memory, forcing us to maintain some part of our attention on the things we don't want to lose. This leaves us with less bandwidth to use for other cognitive tasks. Let's talk about the neuroscience here a little bit. So decades of evidence from cognitive neuroscience suggest that our brains integrate information from various neural networks in what has been termed a global workspace, akin to the concept of working memory. And it operates in cycles of 100 to 200 milliseconds with inputs from various parts of the brain. When this global workspace is flooded with input from one network, such as the attentional network, when we're tunneling on our scarce resource, this crowds out signaling between the workspace and other networks of the brain. And this is why the same farmer, for instance, can show a dip in IQ score of 10 to 20 points when money is tight, is experiencing financial scarcity before a harvest, per se, for instance, compared to when he receives an influx of cash after his harvest has come in. Or why medical students have more trouble shifting their attention to other tasks when studying for their step exams compared to the end of fourth year. We'll get to that example towards the end of the talk. And this flooding of our global workspace or working memory and bandwidth limitation, bandwidth poverty, leads to something that could be termed a scarcity trap, right? It leaves our brains hamstrung, hijacked in a sense, and less able to problem solve, plan ahead, and find long-term solutions to fix the scarcity, because we can't see, we don't have all of our capacity, cognitive capacity to solve the problem. If we remove the tunnel though, we can see our way through more easily. So through the rest of this hour, we'll look at how understanding scarcity and the scarcity mindset can inform our understanding of our patients' experiences of poverty, how it shaped the purpose our team at UCLA has adopted to address family scarcity specifically, and how insights into how scarcity mindset affects us as clinicians can help us better shape medical education and clinical practice. Part one, poverty. Financial scarcity, right? And poverty is another term for financial scarcity. And it's the most commonly discussed example of scarcity across fields, in part because the scarcity of poverty is multidimensional, it's compounding. And the scarcity of cash leads to a scarcity of basic resources like food and housing and transportation, which in turn creates time scarcity because of the constant struggle to survive. And poverty also is a predominant mechanism enacting structural racism. It ultimately leads to scarcity of health and life expectancy. It's foundational as a scarcity concept. The phrase being poor is expensive rings true in the sense that the multidimensional scarcity of poverty costs those experiencing it dearly on average in terms of their quality of life and the length of time with us here on the planet. Though we don't think of it this way often, the reasons poverty is such a powerful social determinant of health have largely to do with the manifestations of scarcity that we've covered so far. Cascades of tunneling and bandwidth taxes triggering the physiologic stress response, and scarcity traps set in motion by historical and structural inequities, and individual circumstances of the household, neighborhood, and country they were born. So this is a really important concept. Incidentally, all four of these pictures are from the same series of pictures that Dorothea Lange took in the Migrant Mother series. All of them were taken in California. One will probably be familiar to most in the audience, but all of them were taken at the same time. I think all of them are sort of similarly iconic. So when talking about poverty and scarcity, let's first talk about how little financial slack many families experience, which leads to trade-offs, which involves sacrificing one need to pay for another more pressing need, which creates a cycle of short-term solutions that lead to long-term problems. So I'm going to show a number of different income thresholds that are considered from various perspectives to be enough to make ends meet or enough to get by in the US. The first is the federal poverty line, which for a family of 4, which we'll consider throughout this, this figure as our sort of family size, benchmarking our measures of enough to make ends meet. For a family of 4, that federal poverty line is $26,500. The next measure is the federal minimum wage, which still is only $7.25 an hour outside of places that have increased the minimum wage, such as California's, Los Angeles increases and San Francisco increases, and other places as well. But for many Americans, making $7.25 an hour, working 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, their total income working that full-time job is only about $15,000, meaning that this family of 4, the 2 parents would need to both work full-time at the minimum wage to actually even break the federal poverty line. So clearly insufficient. The Census Bureau has been reporting a supplemental poverty measure for the last few years, and that supplemental poverty measure incorporates the value, the cash value of public benefits programs. And it puts the federal poverty line threshold at something like $29,000, more or less, which is still not a lot, especially in places like Los Angeles or San Francisco. Which has led many people to posit, economists, social scientists, to posit that actually the percentile, right, the dollar value that corresponds to a federal poverty, or a poverty level that other developed countries would recognize as similar in percentile to where they mark their indicator of poverty, is actually closer to our 200% of the federal poverty line. Hope that makes sense. So essentially, double our federal poverty line, and you get a dollar value that's similar to where many other countries in the developed world would say a family needs to make that or more in order to not be in poverty. This is the low income threshold that a lot of us use when indicating a family is not making enough to make ends meet. But yet even that is likely far below the amount of income necessary to meet the expenses that many families, the basic expenses that many families need to cover in order to break even. So there's some really smart folks at MIT and other places that have proposed a self-sufficiency standard income, which takes into account the cost of living of basic expenses in various metro areas, because the cost of living varies geographically. So when you look at the self-sufficiency standard from those who have done that tallying of the cost of a basic, food budget, housing budget, transportation budget, taxes, all those basic expenses in these various metro areas. If you look even in a very inexpensive geography or metropolitan area like Jackson, Mississippi, even there, the self-sufficiency standard, the amount of income necessary to break even is something like $64,000 a year. In Los Angeles, it's more like $87,000, right, per year for a family of 4 to break even. And keeping it topical, in San Francisco, it's more like $98,000, which is probably not a surprise to anybody on this call. So clearly, right, what I hope is clear, I should say, is that a lot of us in this country are financially stressed, not just those who are below the federal poverty line. And it shouldn't be any wonder that half of Americans can't afford an unexpected $400 expense. This leads to clear trade-offs due to tight budgets for many, many, many families. And I think many more of us Americans find ourselves making trade-offs and tunneling quite often. And that's driving a lot of behavior that isn't talked about in that framework as much as I think it should be. So coming back to trade-offs and tunneling, as opposed to our carefree, leisurely stick figure here in this slide, the experience of scarcity and poverty is intense, right? With multiple pressing needs at once, whether it be health needs because of inaccessibility of coverage, difficulty putting food on the table or keeping a roof over one's head, being behind on bills, the constant threat of not being able to have a consistent work schedule, whatever the case may be. The process of keeping all of those pressing needs in mind and attending to them begins to resemble a juggling of those pressing needs. With the slack and trade-offs and short-term solutions, that beget long-term problems and constant stress. And I would suggest that this is what the poverty trap looks like. Because when the next crisis arrives, as a person is juggling all these pressing needs, and they're tunneling on the latest, most pressing and urgent issue, they have to tunnel on that food ball that's about to fall. Other balls are more likely to be dropped, such as their health. Not attending to their health over the long term. I think this is really profound in terms of its impact on health. And it's relevant for how we can address the stark impact of poverty on health. In response to the huge social gradient that we see in health that we're all well aware of, right? Between the lowest income groups in the dark gray here and the higher income groups, those who are making over 400% of the federal poverty line in this graph, whether it's men or women, we see this 8-year discrepancy in life expectancy, disparity in life expectancy in this graph. And if we were to compare the highest 1% of earners to the lowest 1% of earners, that difference in life expectancy is more like 13 years. In Los Angeles, this is a map, a heat map of poverty density in Los Angeles. We see that there's concentrated poverty in certain areas of the city. And we can map onto that life expectancy measures and see that in areas where the federal poverty, the number of households in poverty is highest and densest in the downtown area and South Los Angeles, life expectancy is roughly 76 years. Compare that to Beverly Hills or La Cañada, Flint Ridge, a high income area with also high education. What you see is a 10 to 12 year difference in life expectancy. So again, poverty has huge implications for health and well-being and life expectancy. And I should say, especially given the emphasis that your Grand Round series has been putting on equity, that these have historical underpinnings. These both life expectancy and income disparities are rooted and structured in historical policy. What I'm showing here is actually a redlining map from 1939 in Los Angeles City that was used by developers to define certain neighborhoods of Los Angeles in 4 different categories. A, green, the most desirable. B, in blue, still desirable. C, definitely misspelled, declining. And D, hazardous. And as you can see, the declining and hazardous areas I've outlined largely in the downtown region. And of course, unfortunately, and tragically, the redlining was based on who lived there, right? Residents who were racial and ethnic minorities, religious minorities, immigrants. That was an explicit set of criteria for how these areas were defined and the valuation of the properties. Carry that forward, the outline maps quite squarely onto the areas that are still the most impoverished in Los Angeles today, as well as those life expectancy disparities that I showed earlier. And taking a recent example of how this impacts health very directly, those redlined areas also correspond quite strongly with the density of COVID cases at the summer peak of the pandemic in Los Angeles. All that's to say that this is our purview as health professionals, thinking about how do we address the scarcity of poverty most effectively. There have been quite a few efforts within the healthcare system to try and address poverty more directly through social needs screening and response. And it's clear from emerging research that most patients support healthcare systems addressing social needs due to poverty. like food insecurity and housing. And this is especially true among those patients who have had social needs themselves. And we found in a medium-sized survey of adult Kaiser patients here in Southern California that 2/3 of the Kaiser patients that we surveyed were interested in the healthcare team asking patients about their social needs, addressing those social needs proactively, and making it part of the healthcare approach because it impacts health. Yet only a fraction of those patients in the same health system who screen positive for social needs actually pursue resource referrals and connect to resources that could address their poverty-related social needs. So this flowchart shows that among those who we reached out to offer social needs screening and intervention, only 81% actually answered the phone. Of those, 64% accepted the screening. Of those, 53% screened positive. And from here, even among those who were positive had identified a social need related to poverty, only 50% enrolled in the program that was being offered, and only 3/4 of those who enrolled made any sort of connection. And we don't know actually whether that connection led to a permanent solution to their social needs and reduction of their financial stress. But why might this be that there's such a dramatic drop-off? Well, I think it has to do with this scarcity trap and poverty trap. Because for patients that are already juggling trade-offs of poverty and health issues, how realistic is it to expect them to find the bandwidth to navigate to a new resource, often outside of the healthcare system, to address their social needs? So rather than asking patients to do something new, right, and to go someplace else or access a new resource to address their scarcity related to poverty, our group wondered whether we could bring anti-poverty services into the clinic as part of healthcare and address that root cause of scarcity and the scarcity mindset driven by financial insecurity. And here are the results of a survey in the pediatrics clinic at Harbor UCLA, which is in the Los Angeles County Department of Health Services safety net system. We found that getting financial help was top of mind for most parents, as you would expect for anyone in the scarcity mindset due to poverty. Roughly over 2/3 actually indicated interest in clinic-based financial services of some kinds, and the most commonly endorsed was employment resources. And the least commonly endorsed, which was still endorsed by about half of the people that we surveyed, was debt consolidation, suggesting that this is really top of mind for our families, and there's a huge demand potentially for these kinds of services. So medical financial partnerships are a way of addressing that more directly, right? Addressing that as part of the healthcare delivery system. And the background here is that my wife, Heather, and I, when we first saw this pattern of financial stress affecting our families and patients in the public hospitals and clinics where we trained, there in Northern California, in San Francisco, that gave us an idea, right? Rather than asking patients to go someplace else to address those needs, we focused on creating a simple pathway to accessing needed anti-poverty services in the clinic. Those became the medical financial partnerships. And since then, we've expanded our sort of conceptions of what a medical financial partnership could include and posited some 3 different models of MFPs that we published on last year. We find that, you know, over about a decade now of our experience using these services and building them out, that by building them into the healthcare visits, families are already attending those visits. And this aligns those services provided with the goals parents have for the health and success of their baby, right? And their own goals as well. By doing that, by achieving that alignment, we're able to get in their tunnel of attention and successfully connect them and help the vast majority of families referred to services. Here's our team, the team of financial coaches that works directly with families in the medical financial partnership at Harbor. We begin with asking families about their financial goals in clinic and then partnering with them to provide bandwidth in the form of skills and resources, helping them break out of the poverty trap. The idea is not only to provide a community of support in addition to addressing, you know, their social needs through identifying resources, but also that young families can rely on their social supports and the coach as they're juggling to make ends meet. Gives them more bandwidth, gives them slack. And some early outcomes from our work, you know, it appears that the clinic parents like what we're doing. because the parents who are randomized to having a financial coach come back to clinic more often and take part in medical financial partnership services. We find that financial coaching parents were about half as likely to no-show compared to controls in the first 6 months of a child's life, with a large difference in probability of not showing up for their visits to the 2-month well-child check that narrows somewhat by 4 months, and then is nearly equivalent by 6 months. But still, we see quite a big difference in terms of likelihood of showing up and also getting their vaccinations during those visits. In a community-based randomized trial of financial coaching that we did preceding our implementation of the financial coaching program in the clinic at Harbor, we found that parents' health-related quality of life improved substantially by 1 year of participation in the program, mostly driven by reduced symptoms of subclinical anxiety and depression. So we're going to keep at this, and we're currently in year 2 of a 5-year trial of the Medical Financial Partnership at Harbor, UCLA, looking at stress, parenting, social needs, and ultimately child developmental outcomes. And we just expanded to another pediatric clinic in the Los Angeles County Department of Health Services to reach more families. Part 2, purpose. So the purpose of this program, the Medical Financial Partnership, to provide families and patients in poverty, allies, and a community of support to support their bandwidth and provide them slack, was inspired by the experience of many families who have successfully escaped poverty, families like mine. This is Francis and Kurt, my grandparents. And I'd like to share a story of their scarcity. And I think it sheds some light not only on how we as physicians can help our patients, but also help each other avoid scarcity traps. So Francis and Kurt were high school sweethearts in a small town in central Illinois. They grew up in the Great Depression and had learned to kind of get by on not much. They didn't have a lot, but they had enough. And shortly after graduating from high school, they got married. Kurt came up from a family of tenant farmers, which were similar to sharecroppers, except that the tenant farmers owned their tools, but he worked the land that his family had leased from the bank for about $35,000, which back in the 1940s was a lot of debt. A large portion of his summer and his summer harvest, I should say, went to interest every year to the bank. And every winter he would pump gas at the gas station, and Francis would work as a substitute teacher here and there to make ends meet. Well, pretty soon Francis and Kurt had a baby after they were married, and then more. And they dressed them in overalls, usually made from burlap sacks that held the seeds from the farm crops. And from a very early age, all the kids had chores on the farm, like putting milk out for the cat, or in my mother's case, in this picture here, bringing the cat to the milk. And my mom is the one with the curly hair here. Life on the farm was hard work. I've heard from my uncles and my mother, but the family got help from a large community of friends and neighbors who were always over at the house watching the kids. And you can see some of those friends and neighbors in the pictures here. But when my mother and other children were still young, her family's life changed in an instant. Kurt was in a car accident one summer and passed away, leaving Francis and the kids not only without their dad, but also without an income in the face of massive debt. Here are the kids. And in that time of extreme scarcity, my family was lucky to have the support of a large community who helped them through. Their friends and neighbors, many of them tenant farmers themselves, organized an auction of Kurt's farming supplies and raised exactly $35,000, just enough to pay the bank what was owed for the farm lease and keep my grandmother out of debt as she moved the family off the farm that they'd lost to a place in town. These friends helped Francis find a job, teaching in a one-room schoolhouse, earning just enough to make ends meet. And her neighbors would constantly bring extra corn and tomatoes, rhubarb, and other food from the small gardens that they had in their yards, so that Francis and the kids had enough. And with the help of scholarships and work study and the support of a community of friends and neighbors, again, my mother and her siblings made it to college and were the first generation in our family to complete a 4-year degree. So once Francis got back on her feet, it wasn't long before she had a backyard garden of her own so that she could bring what she grew to families in the neighborhood going through their own rough times. This is a picture of her in her 80s, still doing that. She brought bags of corn and tomatoes to her neighbors well into old age. And when I visited Illinois in the summers growing up, I got to help do the same. So thinking back on this story of my family, I've often found myself imagining how my grandmother and her kids must have felt, right? How their conception of what life would be like must have contracted so quickly and then expanded again with the help of their neighbors. And imagining this over the years taught me about what's possible for families like my grandmother's. I think now that the first step towards making an impact is changing our perception of what's possible. So how do we change our conception of what's possible? Well, we can change the tunnel. We can change the frame, and through that, see something new for what's possible. To do that, ultimately, we need something that I've been referring to throughout the talk as Slack. So what's Slack? Well, Slack is any resource that allows us to avoid trade-offs. We can't create Slack from scarcity, but we can share Slack with others, especially when we have relative abundance. And privilege and opportunity to relieve scarcity are forms of Slack. Essentially, Slack changes what's possible with the hand that we're dealt. And all of us have benefited from Slack at some point in our lives. So here's a Slack that got me here. Going back to that farm debt payment, my parents were able to, my mom was able to go to college. My parents met in college. So my very existence is dependent upon that Slack having been provided by my grandparents' friends. I had a preschool teacher, mother who invested in me all sorts of tireless educational efforts. And in high school, Slack that was provided to me by a high school history teacher who wrote me a letter of recommendation for college, even though I'd recovered from failing a couple classes and was kind of getting back on my feet academically. That was a huge sort of help along the way. The Slack that I got from the inexplicably generous mentorship and investment that my mentors provided me over the years during my med school and residency training. It's a huge part, obviously, of my path. And Heather's patience and support, my wife, all these things, and most recently, NIH loan repayment program. All these things have been very helpful. And I think it's also highly important to emphasize that other words for Slack are privilege and opportunity, which my family had and many families are still waiting for. So I'd like to take a couple minutes and do an exercise with you to talk about the Slack that got us here, and have you take 2 minutes to describe a time that you were nearing a scarcity trap and Slack was created for you. And if you do that within the 2 minutes and you still have some leftover time, then think of one concrete action you can take to create Slack, an opportunity for others. So to do this, I'll ask that if you're watching this with others at a clinical site and you have somebody else in the room with you, share with a neighbor. Talk about your descriptions of the time you were nearing that scarcity trap and Slack was created for you. If you're not in a room where you have a neighbor to talk with, then please write your description of that moment of Slack in the chat and share it with the group. And I'll keep an eye on the clock for 2 minutes while we do that. Once we're done, I might ask, actually, I might read out some of the comments from the chat. I'm not sure that we can actually do a share out from the pair shares, unfortunately. I wish we could. Okay, go ahead.
And it would be helpful if people use the chat function, not the Q&A function for this, so that we can keep those two things separated.
Thanks, Andrew. seeing lots of great examples of Slack in the chat. If people feel comfortable, feel free, if you're still typing, to switch from sending the chat to all panelists and attendees, because I think people would really enjoy seeing some of these fantastic examples. Really powerful. So I'm reading in the chat things like scholarships, like you know, loved ones' relationships, allowing for flexibility in work, moments when there was financial stress that was relieved through loans or the job just in time. So thank you guys for participating and sharing those. I think it's really powerful to sit with, as I'm seeing Dr. Rogers say, really powerful to sit with the ample Slack that we've received and think about that, and think about how we can create that Slack for others. So I'm not sure how many of the cards reached folks, the cards for humanity that I overnighted and that Charisse was kind enough to distribute, along with, I think Dr. McNamara also helped distribute. But if you got them, you might be wondering what they're for, these cards for humanity. Well, and if you haven't seen them yet, then hopefully you'll see them at your clinical sites where they've been distributed. It could be a fun sort of scavenger hunt for, you know, where did the cards end up? But I hope that you'll think of these cards as a reminder to use your Slack, right? Your privilege to change the game for someone else who may have been dealt a bad hand. And if you've ever played Uno, you know that the Slack of a wild card changes what's possible with the hand you're dealt. Has anybody, maybe you could just drop it in the chat, has anybody played new Uno with these blank wild cards? Hopefully, yes. If not, I'll share what they are. It is kind of an Uno innovation that I've only learned about in the last couple of years through my 7-year-old. So these blank wildcards, not only do they let you use your hand in new ways, like the old wildcards used to, where you could change the type of card you could put down. These cards actually let you change what's possible by writing a new move or a new rule on the card and changing the game right then and there. So, obviously these are yours to keep when you find them, or if you have them already. I just hope that you'll use them to remember to change what's possible, change the rules for someone in a moment of scarcity, and change what's possible to help people out of that scarcity trap. All right. So let's talk about practice. It's part 3. And I'll posit that scarcity is highly relevant to our medical practice as humanistic healers. To illustrate, let's look at a classic example, the Good Samaritan experiment of scarcity, time scarcity among seminary students at Princeton. So these students were told that they had to give a talk at a building across campus, and half were told the talk would be about being a good Samaritan and helping others in distress. And in the Good Samaritan talk group and the other group, half were told that they were late and half were told that they had a few minutes to spare. For all of them, an actor was placed in the same spot along the side of the path along the route across campus. And that actor was slumped over and coughing terribly and looking like they really needed a lot of help. So in this experiment, what determined which students would stop to help the person in distress? It wasn't having been thinking about how to be a good Samaritan by those who had to give a talk on being a good Samaritan. Instead, it was those with less time pressure, right? Less scarcity, time scarcity. And not only were those who had less time pressure more likely to stop, they were actually more likely to even notice that the person was in need of help along the way. When those with less time pressure stopped, they were more likely to actually do something useful to help. In interviews after the study had gone through, had taken place, the students who stopped were more likely to say that they'd even seen the person along the path who was in need of help. And this is obviously relevant to healthcare, where time scarcity is constant and we're in a helping profession, right? We need to be recognizing when folks, there are opportunities to help others. So there's a sort of emerging literature on this, which I think is fascinating, showing that time pressure in primary care settings interrupts adherence to clinical guidelines, which might take more time to fully adhere to. Same thing with opiate prescriptions for low back pain. They seem to increase as the afternoon wears on, and clinics are more pressed and getting sort of more and more behind potentially in their clinical schedules and have less time to spend with patients. There have even been sort of proposals of a Goldilocks sweet spot of an optimal pace and efficiency in hospital work when you have sort of the right number of patients on your census, where you're not overstretched, but you're also not, you don't have too little to do. So I'll just say, in addition to being experts in pathophysiology and medical management, I think through training, we become experts in structuring our time, right? Down to the minute, and this backfires when we don't build enough slack into our daily routines. And time scarcity mindset itself can threaten empathy and our humanistic healthcare, our capacity for that. And I think that begins in medical training, because much of our training involves time scarcity. So let's look at the neuroscience of bandwidth in medical training for a second. There's this really fascinating study from PNAS in 2009 that looked at fMRI evidence comparing working memory and attention in the same medical students before and after taking step 1. And in the next few slides, the data corresponding to students who were at a time when they were studying for step 1 is in red, and those same students, after they had completed step 1 and were less time pressured, is in blue, after they'd recovered, so to speak. So this is your brain on step. And what it's showing here is there's demonstrably less communication and sharing of information from the prefrontal cortex that governs executive function and attention to various neural regions of the brain in the setting of time scarcity and stress. And you can see the difference in those connectivity, the connectivity between those regions here in the downgoing bars. The red downgoing bars predominate, right? They're much larger and often significant. The only bars that are upgoing in the time period where the students were stressed with their step 1 studying was in the connections between the prefrontal cortex and areas of visual processing, right? Because the students are in a book and visually processing information throughout their studying period. And then there's an additional finding that it is kind of summative here. Ultimately, all of these decreases in functional connectivity across various regions of the brain delayed the student's ability to shift their attention, which is what this is showing. Shift cost of about 20 milliseconds compared to the post period, meaning that 20%, if you consider a cycle time of that global workspace we talked about earlier in the talk, 20% of that time, which is usually 100 milliseconds or so, 20% of that time is delayed, right? Or that cycle is delayed by 20%. And this is a visual representation of the bandwidth tax on medical trainees, right? Which represents about a 20% delay in each attentional shift in the attentional task. And over time, that adds up substantially. And this isn't representative of just a single moment in medical training. This kind of scarcity occurs over and over again as we tunnel to our undergraduate GPA and MCAT, then go into diastole, and then tunnel again on preclinical tests in medical school once we've been accepted, and a series of preclinical tests over and over again, narrowing our tunnel to focusing on those things that are so time pressured and feel so urgent, the match, residency itself. And each time the tunnel, I worry, narrows. And I think this phenomenon might provide some insight into the literature that's shown an empathy decline over time in medical training. Perhaps as time scarcity increases among trainees, the bandwidth for the hallmarks of humanistic care, like empathy and human dignity, become more scarce too, right? Just like students at the Princeton seminary whose brains were less likely to even see the person suffering. It's not necessarily that there's some active hidden curriculum that's somehow teaching students to be less caring over time, it's very possible that through repeated experiences of scarcity, students have less bandwidth to cognitively access their fullest selves and the higher order cognitive tasks required for empathic care. But before we get too individualistic about what's driving scarcity in medical training, I think it's really important and critical to recognize that scarcity in healthcare isn't just about the individual. It's baked into systems and cultures of care. And scarcity is fundamentally a structural issue. So take, for example, this hypothetical series of operating rooms and cases, which could just as well be our clinic schedule in any given afternoon. So we have cases back to back to back with little room for error and little buffer. And if everything stays on time, then that works great. And they move through without any trouble and nobody's delayed. But what happens when we have an emergency case that bumps the rest, which will of course happen from time to time. But without slack, the trade-offs compound, and pretty soon, as the emergency case bumps the others, in an effort to find workarounds for the delayed case, you can see this cascade of now half the cases for the day being impacted in some way with a delay. So slack isn't built into the system, and any emergent need to fit in an emergency case, there's not space. So for this structural scarcity problem, I think there's a structural solution, which is to build in slack. And as you can see, in this OR case schedule, there are some openings that are left open to provide that slack. And now when an emergency case happens, as it will, surely, there's slack and bandwidth in the system to adapt. Far fewer cases are bumped and the whole system is more efficient and less stressed, and potentially even more cost saving, because you don't end up with these situations where you're constantly running over, utilizing resources towards the end of the day that didn't anticipate paying overtime, those kinds of things. So slack is structural. I'll leave you with this. As we go through our careers, taking each step and looking ahead towards the next challenge, it's easy to get wrapped up in the busyness, right, and feel trapped by the lack of time and bandwidth. And much of this time scarcity is unavoidable. We definitely signed up for it, right? And I don't want to suggest for a minute that we have it as hard as any of our patients worried about their health or a family that can't make ends meet. That's not at all what I'm suggesting. Instead, what I'm suggesting is that we recognize how scarcity shapes everyone's experience. And we use our privilege and opportunity to provide slack for others, including our colleagues and our patients, clearly. So how will you change what's possible for someone else, right? How will you provide that slack? It could be something as simple as holding your teammate's pager during a talk like this, or it could be a much bigger effort like changing your practice to better address poverty among your patients as a standard part of care. But whatever you choose, I hope these cards, will be reminders in the midst of our perpetual time crunch and tunneling to make sure we're investing our privilege as healers to make others and help others achieve success in their lives, so that for all of us together, scarcity won't hold us back. Thanks very much for your attention. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you very much for that very interesting talk. And as Anda put into the chat earlier, you and Heather are still doing phenomenal work out there. So we have a couple of questions, and I want to remind everybody, as Sundrain said earlier, if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A function as opposed to the chat. The first one is from Rob Lustig, and he says, he's wondering, from a neurobiological perspective, how much scarcity is really fear driving cortisol, driving prefrontal cortical dysfunction? Do you have a response to that?
I don't have an informed response to that, Rob. Unfortunately, that's out of my area of expertise. But I hearken back to our conversations over the years and have come back to the HPA axis as a fundamental driver of the scarcity phenomena, and it's become core to how I think about the the biological effects that I'm trying to prevent in my patients. As we're thinking about addressing scarcity through the medical financial partnerships, a lot of the education that we do of the team, including the financial coaches, and a lot of the community partners that we work with, is about educating them in how stress is embedded in our biology and how dysregulation of the HPA axis and the physiologic stress response is responsible for many of the health consequences that they're already seeing, that they experience in their clients and recognize, but don't have a way to understand it or describe it, or certainly explain it at a biochemical level. So it's powerful. I'll just share that it's been really important for us as clinicians to explain that phenomenon and make that linkage between the sort of economic, what's historically been an economic phenomenon, right? Economists talk about poverty, social scientists talk about poverty. But as clinicians, we have tools to talk about it in new ways and give insight to those who are trying to figure out ways to fix it. And so absolutely neuroendocrinology is central to that.
And the next one is more of a comment than a question, but it would be interesting to hear your commentary on it. Thanks for this presentation. Our team thinks it's important to acknowledge the explicit racial privileges and influences of white supremacy on one's ability to receive and benefit from SLAC. It feels impossible to discuss SLAC and scarcity without specifically discussing race, racial privilege, and racism. And that's from the NICU team over at the General. So,
amen. Yes. I won't attempt to say anything, more informed than that. It's absolutely part and parcel with this discussion, and I hope I wish that I could have more time to emphasize the racial, ethnic, cultural, power, sovereignty, and opportunity inequities that are absolutely intertwined with all of these discussions of poverty and scarcity and SLAC. Thank you for bringing it up.
well, thank you, Adam, again for this really interesting and informative presentation. I commend you on the incredible work that you were doing, and I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Hirsch to say farewell.
Thank you, and I want to extend my thanks to you, Adam, as well. That was really very well done, incredible grand rounds, and a lot of things for us to be thinking about in our day-to-day lives and in our practice as well. Appreciate you taking the time to join us, and I want to wish everybody a good rest of your week. Thanks.
Thanks, everybody. Take care.